March 6, 1944, 11:47 hours, 28,000 feet above Berlin. Hauptmann Heinz Nock, holder of the Knight's Cross and veteran of 400 combat missions, watched through his Messerschmitt Bf-109 GSIXS canopy as a formation approached from the west. The silhouettes were unmistakable. American heavy bombers, B-17s probably, escorted by the usual thunderbolts. He smiled beneath his oxygen mask. The P-47s would have to turn back soon. Their fuel wouldn't allow them to penetrate this deep into the Reich. Then the real slaughter would begin. But something was wrong. The escort fighters weren't turning back. They were still there, silver glints against the winter sky, maintaining formation over the bombers. And they weren't thunderbolts. These aircraft were sleeker, more elegant, with a distinctive scoop beneath their bellies. Nock had seen intelligence photographs of these machines. The North American P-51 Mustang. American long-range escorts that supposedly couldn't survive against Luftwaffe fighters. All aircraft, this is Adler 1. Nock transmitted to his squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11. New American type at Angels 28. We bounced them from above. Standard attack. They won't last long. What Hauptmann Nock didn't know, what none of the 69 Luftwaffe fighters climbing toward combat that morning could have imagined, was that they were about to encounter the weapon that would destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm completely. Within 6 weeks, the joke among German pilots would change from mocking the Mustang to praying they never saw one. The aircraft they were dismissing as another American experiment was about to transform from novelty to nightmare, and the mathematics of its design would prove more devastating than any weapon Germany had faced. The P-51 Mustang wasn't supposed to exist. It was born from British desperation, American innovation, and a marriage of technologies that would create the most lethal fighter aircraft of World War II. The story began not in American factories, but in a British purchasing commission office in New York City, April 1940. The Royal Air Force was bleeding aircraft faster than British factories could replace them. The Battle of France was consuming fighters at catastrophic rates. Hurricane and Spitfire production, even running at maximum capacity, couldn't keep pace with losses. The Air Ministry needed additional fighter production from any source, including American manufacturers who had never built a modern combat aircraft. North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, had been producing training aircraft and light bombers. When the British approached them about building P-40 Warhawks under license, company president James Dutch Kindleberger made a bold counterproposal. "Give us 120 days, he told the British, and we'll design a fighter superior to anything currently flying. The British, desperate and with few options, agreed. But they imposed strict requirements. The aircraft had to use the Allison V-1710 engine, readily available and already in production. It had to mount heavy armament. It had to have range exceeding anything in current RAF service. And it had to be ready for prototype testing in exactly 120 days. What emerged from North American's design team, led by Chief Engineer Edgar Schmud, was revolutionary. Instead of copying existing designs, Schmud's team started from aerodynamic principles. They created a laminar flow wing, a design that minimized drag by maintaining smooth airflow over the wing surface. They positioned the radiator beneath the fuselage in a duct that actually added thrust through the Narrated effect, where heated air expanded and accelerated, creating forward push. They gave it the most spacious cockpit of any fighter, with visibility that exceeded even the vaunted Spitfire. The NA-73X prototype flew on October 26, 1940, exactly 102 days after the contract was signed. It was faster than the P-40, faster than the Hurricane, nearly as fast as the Spitfire, and it had been designed and built in less time than it took most factories to tool up for production. But there was a problem. A fatal flaw that would nearly kill the program before it began. The Allison engine, while powerful and reliable at low altitudes, lost performance dramatically above 15,000 feet. Its single-stage supercharger couldn't maintain manifold pressure in thin air. This meant the early Mustangs, designated P-51A and A-36A Apache by the U.S. Army, were relegated to ground attack and tactical reconnaissance roles. Fast and maneuverable at low altitude, they were mediocre at the high altitudes where bomber escort combat occurred. The Germans had encountered these early Mustangs in North Africa and Italy. Luftwaffe pilots found them dangerous opponents below 12,000 feet, but easily outclimbed and outperformed at altitude. Intelligence assessments filed with the Luftwaffe High Command in late 1943 were dismissive. The American Mustang fighter lacks the engine performance for strategic operations. It poses no threat to Reich defense operations. That assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. The transformation began in a Rolls-Royce testing facility in Hucknall, England, in October 1942. Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker had flown an Allison-powered Mustang and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was superb. The engine was the limitation. Harker wrote a memo that would change aerial warfare. If this aircraft was fitted with a Merlin engine, it would be a world beater. The Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire legendary, featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power output to 30,000 feet. Rolls-Royce engineers calculated that combining the Merlin's high-altitude performance with the Mustang's low-drag airframe would create a fighter with unprecedented speed and range. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew on October 13, 1942. Test pilots were stunned. The aircraft that had been merely good became extraordinary. With the Packard-built Merlin V1650 engine producing 1,490 horsepower, the P-51B reached 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. More importantly, its range with external fuel tanks exceeded 1,800 miles, more than double any existing fighter. By December 1943, the first P-51Bs were arriving in England, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group. The statistics were impressive, but statistics don't win air battles. The Luftwaffe's veteran pilots had seen impressive aircraft before and defeated them through superior tactics and experience. The real test would come when these silver fighters met Germany's best over the Reich itself. That test came on March 4, 1944, during the first American bombing raid on Berlin. Oberleutnant Walther Dahl, Staffelkapitän of 3/Jagdgeschwader 3, was among the first Luftwaffe pilots to engage the new Mustangs in sustained combat over Germany. His after-action report, filed on March 5, 1944, marked the beginning of what would become a flood of increasingly desperate assessments from German fighter pilots. Encountered approximately 30 new American escort fighters at 26,000 feet over Brandenburg. Aircraft type, P-51. Initial engagement appeared favorable. Our altitude advantage allowed first attack from above. Destroyed one B-17 bomber. Disengaged to reposition for second attack. American fighters followed us. At full throttle. At 27,000 feet. They not only followed, they caught us. That last line represented a paradigm shift in aerial combat. For 3 years, Luftwaffe fighters had relied on superior climb and high-altitude performance. When combat became unfavorable, they could always disengage, climb away, and reset for another attack. American fighters, particularly the heavy P-47 Thunderbolts, couldn't follow into the thin air above 28,000 feet. The Mustangs could follow anywhere. And they did. Dahl's report continued, attempted to dive away. P-51 followed to deck level, maintaining pursuit for 47 kilometers. Aircraft demonstrated speed advantage at all altitudes. Lost Unteroffizier Schmidt when his aircraft was caught during attempted escape. Observed 3 other Bf-109s destroyed during disengagement phase. Assessment: this aircraft represents fundamental shift in operational environment. The March 6th mission, where Hauptmann Nock led his squadron into combat, would validate Dahl's assessment with brutal clarity. Nock's squadron, comprising 16 Messerschmitt Bf-109G-6 fighters, dove from 31,000 feet toward the American bomber formation. Standard tactics called for a high-speed diving attack on the bombers, fire a burst from the 20mm cannon and 13mm machine guns, then use the energy from the dive to zoom climb back to altitude. The attack run would take perhaps 10 seconds. Then they would be gone, resetting for another pass. They never completed the first attack. As Nock's fighters accelerated through 29,000 feet, the Mustang escorts turned into them. Not the defensive weave that P-47s flew, staying close to bombers. The P-51s came straight at the attacking German fighters, head-on, guns firing. Nock's combat report describes the moment. they didn't evade. They attacked. At 29,000 feet, they had full power, full maneuverability. They flew as if at sea level. The head-on pass scattered Noak's formation. 2 Bf-109s collided, trying to avoid the Americans. A third took hits in his engine and dove away, trailing smoke. The remaining 13 pulled up, attempting to regain altitude advantage. The Mustangs followed them up. At 32,000 feet, altitude where the Messerschmitt's DB605 engine was gasping for oxygen, producing barely 60% of rated power, the Merlins and the American fighters were still delivering full performance. The Mustangs not only matched the German climb, they exceeded it. It was impossible, Noak wrote in his diary that night. We were at our ceiling. They were still accelerating. Oberfähnrich Werner opened fire on a P-51 at 32,000 feet. Good deflection, should have been a kill. The American didn't even break formation, just rolled inverted and dove away. We couldn't follow. Our engines couldn't sustain the chase. Of the 16 Bf-109s that attacked that morning, 5 were destroyed, 3 damaged beyond repair, and 2 pilots were killed. The American bomber formation they had been trying to intercept lost 2 aircraft. The P-51 escorts lost 0. The implications were immediate and terrifying for Luftwaffe Fighter Command. The Americans could now escort their bombers anywhere in Germany. There was no refuge, no safe altitude, no depth to German airspace that provided sanctuary. Luftwaffe fighters would have to fight through American escorts to reach the bombers. And those escorts were better than anything Germany could field. Major Wilhelm Batz, one of Germany's most successful aces with over 200 victories, encountered P-51s on March 8 during a mission over Erkert. His assessment, forwarded to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, was blunt. The American Mustang is superior to our fighters in every measurable way. Speed, climb, range, firepower, and pilot visibility. Our tactical advantage was predicated on the ability to engage and disengage at will. The P-51 removes that option. We must now fight to conclusion in every engagement. Against superior numbers, with inferior aircraft, the mathematics are not sustainable. The mathematics Batz referenced were indeed unsustainable. Each P-51 carried 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns with 1,880 rounds of ammunition. The combined rate of fire exceeded 4,800 rounds per minute. At the standard convergence range of 300 yards, all 6 guns' trajectories intersected, creating a cone of destruction that shredded anything in its path. German fighters typically mounted 120mm cannon with 200 rounds and 2 13mm machine guns with 300 rounds each. Superior individual round effectiveness, but far less total firepower. A Mustang pilot could maintain continuous fire for nearly 25 seconds. A Bf-109 pilot had perhaps 8 seconds of cannon fire before exhausting ammunition. But firepower statistics alone don't explain the psychological impact of the P-51. What destroyed German pilot morale was the totality of American advantage. The Mustang was faster in level flight. It could outdive any German fighter. It could outclimb them at altitude. It had better visibility. It had longer range. And there were hundreds of them. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 77, wrote in his memoirs about the impact of the Mustang's arrival. We had faced numerical disadvantage before. We had fought against aircraft with specific superior characteristics. But we had always possessed tactical options. We could decline unfavorable combat. We could force fights at altitudes or speeds that favored us. The P-51 removed every tactical option. It was better than our aircraft in every regime of flight, and there was no running from it. The first time a Luftwaffe pilot realized he couldn't escape came during a mission on March 15, 1944. Lieutenant Hans Ehlers, flying a Focke-Wulf FW-190A-8, was bounced by Mustangs near Augsburg at 24,000 feet. He dove away at full throttle, the FW-190's standard escape maneuver. At 450 miles per hour in a 70-degree dive, no Allied fighter should have been able to follow. The P-51s not only followed, they closed the gap. Ehlers pulled out of the dive at 8,000 feet, pulled maximum G loading into a climbing turn, attempting to use the Focke-Wulf's superior roll rate to evade. The Mustang matched his turn, then cut inside his radius. Ehlers's wingman, Unteroffizier Kurt Bauer saw the entire engagement. His combat report states, Lieutenant Ehlers executed perfect defensive maneuvers. Every tactic should have succeeded. The American stayed with him through dive, through maximum rate turn, through climb, then fired. Ehlers's aircraft exploded. Time from first contact to destruction, 47 seconds. 47 seconds from healthy aircraft to flaming wreckage. The speed of lethality was unprecedented. By April 1944, Luftwaffe pilot losses were accelerating catastrophically. The arrival of additional P-51 groups meant American bombers could strike anywhere in Germany with full escort. Luftwaffe fighters had to intercept or allow uncontested bombing of German cities. But interception meant penetrating a screen of Mustangs that killed German pilots faster than training schools could replace them. The loss rates tell the story. In March 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 56 pilots killed in action over Germany. In April, 245 pilots were killed. In May, 395 pilots died. These weren't novices. These were experienced pilots, many with hundreds of missions, men who understood aerial combat intimately. They were being systematically destroyed by an aircraft that was simply better in every measurable way. General Major Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, requested an urgent meeting with Göring on April 23, 1944. His report, preserved in captured German documents, laid out the crisis. The American P-51 has created an untenable operational environment. Our fighters cannot effectively engage enemy bombers without first defeating numerical superior escorts that possess superior aircraft. Current loss rates project complete destruction of trained fighter pilot cadre within 4 months. Recommend immediate withdrawal of daylight fighter operations and concentration on night fighting and jet fighter development. Göring, infuriated by what he perceived as defeatism, rejected Galland's assessment. The order came down: attack the bombers. Ignore the fighters. Accept casualties as necessary. The result was slaughter. On May 12, 1944, during a maximum effort against oil facilities in central Germany, the Luftwaffe committed over 400 fighters. They faced approximately 800 American escort fighters, 2/3 of them Mustangs. The Germans lost 65 aircraft destroyed and 38 damaged. American losses, 10 fighters. One German pilot who survived that mission, Feldwebel Otto Wessling, described the experience in post-war interviews. We were like sheep among wolves. We tried to reach the bombers. The Mustangs came from every direction. Above, below, from the sun, from clouds. They had altitude, they had speed, they had numbers. And they had pilots who weren't afraid to press attacks to point-blank range. That last observation was critical. German fighter pilots by mid-1944 were increasingly willing to break off attacks, to disengage and survive rather than press home potentially suicidal runs against protected bombers. American pilots, sensing German desperation, became more aggressive. P-51 pilots developed tactics called rat racing, where they would chase individual German fighters to ground level, maintaining pursuit for 50, 70, even 100 miles until the German aircraft ran out of fuel, ammunition, or pilot skill. Oberleutnant Fritz Buchholz was caught in such a pursuit on May 29, 1944. Flying a Bf-109 G-10, one of the latest variants with improved performance, he was bounced by 4 Mustangs near Kassel. For 41 minutes, he attempted to escape, using every tactical trick he knew. He dove to 150 feet, weaving between trees and hills. He reversed course suddenly, attempting to get behind his pursuers. He flew through ground fire from German flak batteries. Nothing worked. They stayed with me, Buchholz recalled after being captured. 50 feet off the ground, at maximum speed, through terrain that should have made pursuit impossible. They matched every move. Finally, I ran out of fuel. I had to belly land in a field. As I climbed from my aircraft, one of the American fighters flew over at barely 100 feet. The pilot waved, just waved, as if this had been training exercise. That was when I understood. They weren't desperate. They weren't even particularly aggressive. They were just better. Better trained, better equipped, better supported. We had already lost. We just hadn't admitted it yet. The admission would come at the highest levels by June 1944. Galland, in a staff meeting on June 18th, presented statistics that couldn't be argued with. Since January 1st, 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost 2,262 fighter pilots killed in action over Germany. Of those, approximately 1,600 had been killed after the P-51 groups reached full operational capacity in March. The Mustang, Galland stated flatly, has destroyed the Luftwaffe fighter force as an effective strategic weapon. We can no longer prevent American bombers from attacking any target in Germany. Our pilot replacement rate cannot match losses. Our fuel supplies are being destroyed by the very bombers we cannot effectively intercept. The Reich defense mission has failed. By July 1944, American P-51 groups had evolved beyond escort duties. With bomber formations protected by layers of Mustangs, additional groups were freed for offensive missions. They began what pilots called freelance hunting, sweeping ahead of bomber formations, attacking German airfields, strafing locomotives, and most devastatingly, destroying German fighters during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. The tactic was simple and brutal. P-51s would orbit known Luftwaffe bases, waiting for German fighters to take off or attempt to land. Catching an aircraft during these phases, when speed and maneuverability were compromised, meant almost certain destruction. On a single day, July 7, 1944, P-51s destroyed 23 German fighters on the ground and 14 more during takeoff and landing phases. The psychological impact was devastating. German pilots now faced the possibility of being killed before they ever reached combat altitude or after surviving a mission, but before reaching safety. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, the same pilot who had dismissed the P-51 as a novelty in March, wrote in his diary entry for August 14, 1944, "We no longer speak of the P-51 with contempt. We call them by their proper name now, Die Mustang, or more commonly, Der Würger, the choker, because that's what they do. They choke us. They're at altitude when we take off. They follow us to target. They pursue us home. They wait over our fields as we try to land. There is no phase of flight where we are safe from them. Flying has become an exercise in postponing the inevitable." The statistics by autumn 1944 were merciless. The 8th Air Force P-51 groups had collectively destroyed over 4,000 German aircraft in air combat, with a loss of approximately 420 of their own, a kill ratio exceeding 9-1. But even those numbers understate the Mustang's impact. For every German fighter destroyed, several others burned precious fuel in ineffective pursuit or were forced to abandon attack runs to evade escorts. Hundreds of German pilots, facing impossible odds, chose to land at neutral Swiss or Swedish airfields, internment being preferable to certain death. Thousands of hours of flight training were wasted producing replacement pilots who survived an average of 3 combat missions before being killed or captured. The Luftwaffe's training program, already decimated by fuel shortages, couldn't produce pilots with the skills necessary to survive against veteran American squadrons flying superior aircraft. One of the American fighters flew over at barely 100 feet. The pilot waved, just waved, as if this had been training exercise. That was when I understood. They weren't desperate. They weren't even particularly aggressive. They were just better trained, better equipped, better supported. We had already lost. We just hadn't admitted it. The admission would come at the highest levels by June 1944. Galland, in a staff meeting on June 18th, presented statistics that couldn't be argued with. Since January 1st, 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost 2,262 fighter pilots killed in action over Germany. Of those, approximately 1,600 had been killed after the P-51 groups reached full operational capacity in March. The Mustang, Galland stated flatly, has destroyed the Luftwaffe fighter force as an effective strategic weapon. We can no longer prevent American bombers from attacking any target in Germany. Our pilot replacement rate cannot match losses. Our fuel supplies are being destroyed by the very bombers we cannot effectively intercept. The Reich defense mission has failed. By July 1944, American P-51 groups had evolved beyond escort duties. With bomber formations protected by layers of Mustangs, additional groups were freed for offensive missions. They began what pilots called freelance hunting, sweeping ahead of bomber formations, attacking German airfields, strafing locomotives, and most devastatingly, destroying German fighters during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. The tactic was simple and brutal. P-51s would orbit known Luftwaffe bases, waiting for German fighters to take off or attempt to land. Catching an aircraft during these phases, when speed and maneuverability were compromised, meant almost certain destruction. On a single day, July 7, 1944, P-51s destroyed 23 German fighters on the ground and 14 more during takeoff and landing phases. The psychological impact was devastating. German pilots now faced the possibility of being killed before they ever reached combat altitude or after surviving a mission, but before reaching safety. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, the same pilot who had dismissed the P-51 as a novelty in March, wrote in his diary entry for August 14, 1944, "We no longer speak of the P-51 with contempt. We call them by their proper name now, Die Mustang, or more commonly, Der Werger, the choker, because that's what they do. They choke us. They're at altitude when we take off. They follow us to target. They pursue us home. They wait over our fields as we try to land. There is no phase of flight where we are safe from them. Flying has become an exercise in postponing the inevitable." The statistics by autumn 1944 were merciless. The 8th Air Force P-51 groups had collectively destroyed over 4,000 German aircraft in air combat, with a loss of approximately 420 of their own, a kill ratio exceeding 9-1. But even those numbers understate the Mustang's impact. For every German fighter destroyed, several others burned precious fuel in ineffective pursuit or were forced to abandon attack runs to evade escorts. Hundreds of German pilots, facing impossible odds, chose to land at neutral Swiss or Swedish airfields, internment being preferable to certain death. Thousands of hours of flight training were wasted producing replacement pilots who survived an average of 3 combat missions before being killed or captured. The Luftwaffe's training program, already decimated by fuel shortages, couldn't produce pilots with the skills necessary to survive against veteran American squadrons flying superior aircraft. New German pilots in late 1944 received perhaps 150 flight hours before being thrust into combat. American pilots arrived at operational squadrons with over 400 hours, including extensive gunnery training and tactical instruction. Major George Peter Eder, one of the few Luftwaffe pilots to survive the entire war with over 70 victories, described the hopelessness of late-war German fighter operations. By October 1944, we were sending boys into combat. 18, 19 years old, barely capable of flying their aircraft, with no combat experience. We would brief them, knowing most wouldn't survive their first mission. The Mustangs would tear them apart. The experienced pilots who remained tried to protect the novices, but we couldn't be everywhere. And there were so many Mustangs. Always more Mustangs. The final psychological break came in November 1944 when Mustangs began flying missions beyond even bomber escort. P-51s, fitted with additional internal fuel tanks and carrying rockets or bombs, conducted independent strike missions deep into Germany. They attacked industrial targets, rail yards, communication centers. The aircraft that Germans had once mocked as unsuitable for combat was now conducting offensive operations with impunity throughout the Reich. On November 27, 1944, over 500 P-51s conducted a coordinated strike against oil production facilities across Germany, while simultaneously escorting bomber formations and conducting defensive patrols over advanced Allied positions. 3 separate mission types, executed simultaneously, penetrating to maximum range. The operational flexibility was something the Luftwaffe could no longer match. Oberst Walter Grabmann, commanding officer of JAG Division 1, wrote in his final operational report before being relieved of command in December 1944, "The P-51 Mustang has rendered German fighter operations obsolete. We cannot match its performance. We cannot escape it. We cannot replace losses fast enough to maintain operational strength. The aircraft we once dismissed as another failed American experiment has proven to be the most effective fighter weapon of the war. Our initial assessment was not merely wrong, it was catastrophically delusional." By January 1945, organized Luftwaffe fighter resistance over Germany had effectively ceased. Not because Germany lacked fighters, they still had approximately 1,500 operational aircraft, but because they lacked fuel, trained pilots, and any tactical doctrine that could overcome American advantages. The few missions flown were desperate, often suicidal affairs where survival was unexpected. The transformation was complete. The aircraft that German pilots had laughed at in early 1944, calling it just another American toy, had become the symbol of their destruction. The Flying Coffin nickname had reversed with savage irony. It wasn't the Mustang pilots who were dying. It was everyone else. The final statistics tell the story of the Mustang's dominance. From January 1944 through May 1945, P-51 groups destroyed approximately 5,000 German aircraft in aerial combat, while losing 2,520 of their own to all causes, including ground fire, accidents, and combat. In fighter-versus-fighter engagements, the kill ratio approached 10-to-1 in favor of the Mustang. But numbers alone can't capture the psychological transformation. The aircraft that entered service as a question mark, doubted by American pilots and dismissed by German commanders, had proven to be exactly what British purchasing agents had hoped for in 1940. The war-winning fighter that could escort bombers anywhere and defeat any opposition. Hauptmann Heinz Nock survived the war. In his memoirs, published in 1953, he wrote about his first encounter with P-51s over Berlin. "I thought they would be easy victories. American pilots in an untested design, facing the best fighters and pilots in the world. I was wrong about everything. The Americans weren't inferior pilots. The Mustang wasn't an untested design. And by March 1944, we were no longer the best. We had been surpassed, and we would never catch up." The P-51 Mustang flew its last combat mission in 1984, 40 years after it first appeared over Berlin. In that time, it had served in 12 different air forces, fought in 7 wars, and established a reputation as perhaps the finest piston-engine fighter ever built. But its greatest achievement was measured in the spring of 1944, when it broke the back of the Luftwaffe and proved that American engineering, married to British power, could create weapons that didn't just match German technology, but exceeded it so completely that resistance became pointless. The German aces who had mocked it in March learned to fear it by April. By May, they were dying in numbers that destroyed the Luftwaffe's operational capability. By June, the joke had become their epitaph, the Flying Coffin. But not for the pilots inside. For everyone who faced it.